All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me just remind everybody and remind myself to turn your phones on to silent. And welcome to Orange County School Board's work session, which has been scheduled for today, Tuesday, June 10th, 2025, for the purpose of discussing Policy JIC, which is this Code of Student Conduct. The public will not have an opportunity to participate in this work session by providing public comment because this is not a regularly scheduled school board meeting and no action will be taken and there will be no, I just said that. And we also won't take general public comments, but we will, of course, later on this afternoon. Thank you all that are here in the room joining us, and anyone who is on the line, thank you as well. And now let me call on the superintendent to lead us. Pardon me? And we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, no, we can do the Pledge of Allegiance. And
good. Thank you. Too many meetings already this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. This morning, our team is bringing back to the board revisions to our Code of Conduct. The comments that were received at the previous work session were incorporated into the changes that will be presented this morning. I'm going to turn it over to the team to review the proposed changes. And then we'll be able to open it up for any comments or questions the board may have.
Good morning, Chair, School Board members, Dr. Vasquez. We're here today to discuss restitution and acts of hate. So at the last work session, restitution was added to a level 2 offense, and it was also added to level 3 and 4. And acts of hate was added to level 3 and level 4. So on page 15. All right, on page 15, restitution, level 2 is a disciplinary response. Again, it's also, if you go to, your pages are different than
can you move the, I know it's difficult, if you can move the mic a little closer, which I know is difficult because you have a notebook in front of you, but the mic is so sensitive. Thank you.
All right, we also added acts of hate. It's going to be a level 3 HH, an act or attempted act to cause physical injury, emotional suffering, or property damage when the victim is selected by the perpetrator based upon hostility to the race, color, religion, age, sex, natural origin, marital status, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, genetic information, language spoken, or homeless status of the victim through intimidation, harassment, racial ethnic slurs, vandalism, force, or threat of force. And that's our level 3 definition for acts of hate. And again, we added restitution as a disciplinary offense, a disciplinary response, to level 3. We're going to move on to level 4.
Can you roll up the slide just a minute, or down, whichever way? Yeah. Okay. No, that was, I just wanted to see the parking at the same time.
Oh, sorry.
And go back to the previous slide. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
And then we're going to move on to level 4, acts of hate. which is the same definition as level 3, but we added the word repeated. So the first time, it will be a level 3, and the second time, it will be a level 4. Also, before it's determined to be a 3 or 4, all acts of hate offenses, they must consult with OCPS Legal Services before moving forward.
And the consequences for level 3?
Level 3 consequences. So our disciplinary responses did not change. It's the
Pardon
same.
me?
The disciplinary responses did not change for level 3.
Okay.
The only thing that was added for a disciplinary response was the restitution.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Go to the restitution definition. Okay, it's on page 52, acts of. And on the parent-student section notification, we added, it used to be acts of hate, hate speech. Now it's acts of hate. Pursuant to School Board Policy JB, equal education opportunity, all students attending school in OCPS should be treated according to a unitary code, which applies equally regardless of race, color, religion, age, sex, national origin, marital status, disability, sexual orientation, genetic information, genetic identity or expression, language spoken, homelessness, or any other reason prohibited by law. And then we added an act of hate occurs when a student intentionally selects the victim because of any protected characteristics identified in policy JB. An act of hate can be found on the basis of speech, including but not limited to threats and harassment, on the basis of conduct, including but not limited to battery or fighting, or on the basis of damage to property, including but not limited to theft and destruction of property, vandalism. All charges under the category of an act of hate must be reviewed with the OCPS Office of Legal Services for compliance with law. And then we also added a definition for restitution. Next page. All right. If a student takes or damages school property or the property of others, they may be required to pay restitution to the victim or OCPS. This obligation will remain on the student's discipline record until the restitution is paid in full. Payment plans or alternative forms of restitution can be arranged with the school principal.
All right, feedback from board members? I'm sorry, Member Ferrand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for going over these different areas. So just a couple questions. If we want to just stay here on page 54, the question I would have with the restitution, how will that be enforced if, so it says like we may require, if we may, then how many kids would say, well, I can't pay it?
So levels 1, 2, and 3 is left up to the principals. It's a school-based decision. I'm really not sure, and I think that was part of the problem. We used to have restitution in our code, and we removed it during the 2014-2015 school year because we had discussion, and just like you're seeing, it was hard to determine how you was going to keep track of who was going to pay and if kids could afford to pay. So we felt like it wasn't fair.
But then how do we hold kids responsible? Because they shouldn't be damaging our facilities. And if, we look back at the TikTok trend where they were the devious lick and pulling out the bathroom sinks and destroying the bathrooms, and then it's just sort of a slap on the wrist. At what point do we say enough is enough?
So it depends on the dollar amount, because during that TikTok challenge, a lot of those damages rose to the value of a level 4, and kids received a level 4 offense. We didn't charge restitution, but they did receive a consequence.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Dr. Vasquez.
Yeah, thank you. So the issue with restitution lies in the ability for the family to be able to pay. That is why at the last work session, the board asked or an alternative form of restitution can be arranged. That could be that there's after-school community service. It could be that they stay and tutor, children for a certain amount of time. And so it's not, the board did not want to limit it to just the dollar amount, because there are some families that may not be able to afford to pay that. And that's why we added that last section, alternative forms of restitution. But it is going to be left up to the school to determine, what that's going to be. We certainly can provide guidance, but that was part of the determination when this was asked to be added to the code.
Perfect. Which I agree with. I think that's a great plan. I wonder, could we maybe reword then just the part where it says they may be required to pay restitution? Could we say they will be required to either pay restitution, or somehow word that where it's restitution is required whether you're paying or it's an alternative form? And then down below it says payment plans or alternative forms.
All right, let me go to the superintendent.
The reason we're not putting it as a definitive, because there's always a chance that, and I'll give an example, maybe it's a student with a disability that doesn't understand the consequence, or it's part of their disability. And so this gives us the flexibility to look at those cases that have certain elements of it that would preclude the child from having to pay restitution.
Okay. Okay.
Just a follow-up on that question, then I'll go to Member Vanos. But in other areas of the discipline code where we use the term shall, that same exception would always apply even when we have the word shall, correct?
It depends on what the statute says related to the offense.
Okay.
So for some, that it is required that you do X, Y, and Z. For example, with a level 4 consequence, you have to have a suspension for a period of time. So that's a shall. But in other areas, you have the flexibility to be able to work the consequences to what best meets the need of the school and of the particular situation.
Okay, so in the case of shall, where there's a statutory consequence, if you have a student and the behavior is determined to be a result of their disability, that shall still applies?
Well, so if you commit a level 4 offense and you are assumed with disability, you do have the suspension. It may be for a shortened period of time, but there is a suspension that takes place.
Okay, okay. Yes.
Thank you. And then on page 20, when we're talking about acts of hate, I'm just curious, the statement of emotional suffering, I feel like this could become an issue. Because anybody could say that they are emotionally suffering based on anyone's, they may have given them a facial expression or said something that to them they feel it's emotional suffering, but it wasn't spoken out of that, out of hate. So at what point are we, I feel like this is, I know Member Salamanca has mentioned this before, but this is a slippery slope. I think we do have to kind of keep this very concise. This is extremely broad, in my opinion, and I think we need to look into the acts of hate more. I like having this here, and I know we've discussed it before where, in the case that we had earlier in the year, which really brought this to light, we were able to use vandalism as one of the disciplinary code. However, we could use vandalism plus the acts of hate because it was more of an act of hate. And but if we start going down the slippery slope of emotional suffering, to me, I think this needs to be more of a blatant act of hate, not just somebody saying, I feel I'm getting emotional suffering because I'm sitting next to a kid who thinks differently than me and it makes me feel uncomfortable, so I feel it's an act of hate. That's where I think we need to, as a board, really discuss this and kind of see, can we make this a little more concise?
Dr. Vasquez.
So, please correct me if I'm wrong. Lots going on these days, but there's another version, correct? We were going to have a discussion about whether to include this or not. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
There's a different version of the code. Sorry, get close. There's a different version of the code in which we removed acts of hate completely because under Cessor, most offenses can have a, as Mr. Pomeraney has explained before, a heightened, if you will, Cessor has where you can attach a acts of hate to, per se, like a vandalism, which will take it to another level.
Can you explain that more? Because, so for instance, when this student that we had seen previously with the Israeli flag and had, marked it up and vandalized it, I don't believe any of that was like an acts of hate attached to that.
No, because I'll let Mr. Pomeraney speak on that one.
Mr. Pomeraney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, still getting over whatever it was that I've had for 2 weeks. So I know I've had the Z-Pack, don't worry about it. No, with respect to the acts of hate, this was not an act of hate or hate speech under our code, because what we determined is the child was engaged in his right to free speech to comment on matters of political concern, i.e. the conflict that's going on in Israel between the Hamas and the Israeli government. So this child did not have an enhancement for his penalty, because that's what acts of hate or hate speech, in the criminal code, it's an enhancement on the underlying criminal offense. So if it was vandalism and the person was targeted because they were Jewish or because they were African American or whatever it is, it would enhance the penalty up one level in the criminal code. With respect to our code of conduct, it is something that we didn't have a particular offense for previously. We had hate speech within the code, but we did not have it in the levels of offenses that we have now. So the board asked, can we add it in on the level of offenses now? The last time we had the discussion, it was, wow, this is a very, very slippery slope, as in this situation, how would we handle it? And so what we did is we drafted language that sort of tracked the acts or the criminal enhancement from the criminal code, but we also put in there the must consult with OCPS legal services, because to your point, Member Ferrant, to the extent that it doesn't rise to the level of being actual acts of hate, we want to make sure, and it encompasses a kid's right to free speech, we want to make sure that we take care of that and we don't charge this offense. As I said the last time with you all, when it comes to our office, we are going to err on the side of the kid's First Amendment rights, and only if it is eminently clear that this constitutes an act of hate would we sign off on saying, okay, go ahead and charge under this particular provision. So using the example that you just raised with the Israeli flag, even under this language, in my view, it wouldn't have gotten there because this child was engaged in political speech, commenting on Israel's conduct of its war with Hamas. So we wouldn't have charged that kid with an act of hate, but we did charge the child with vandalism under the code. So that's the hard part. And so this is everybody's look of perplexion is what we saw last time, which is why what we were doing here is bringing it back. We have two options, one with this language, one without this language. So the board has to decide, are we going to have this in the code? And we discussed things like we can have it in the code as deterrent. If kids think that they may get charged with this and they may get a bigger penalty coming out of it, it may act as a deterrent. But the board's got to have to decide, is this something we want in the code? Is it worth the trouble of having in the code? Because inevitably, if we charge somebody with an act of hate, that's going to be a very high profile thing. Folks are going to contest it. It's probably going to come to you all, especially on the level 4 version of it. And it's going to be a very difficult thing to administer. But if the board wants it, that's obviously you all are the policymakers and you make that determination. But we have the second version without this language. If the board says, you know what, our code works as is, we don't want to deal with the First Amendment issues and the potential issues coming out of it, let's just leave the code as is without this language. That's what we're here to decide. And we didn't have 2 of our members last time, and we have all of our members now. So the reason why we're bringing it back is so you all can have a full consideration of this and make the determination which way you want to go.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll go to Member Vanos. For my benefit, I know I wasn't here. Who else wasn't here? Okay. Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, got it. Thank you. Member Vanos.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so I'll keep on this topic since we're here now. And John, Mr. Palmerini, I know I asked you this question the very first time we talked about this, and I apologize, I just don't remember the answer. Is it a possibility that we just use acts of hate as a enhancer to punishment rather than creating a separate offense? And I know I asked this, and I just can't remember what you said.
I believe my answer was yes, you can use it as an enhancement rather than having it as a separate provision in the code. You can do that if the board wants to do that.
Okay.
If I may jump in. So again, for Cessor does have hate crime related. It states that all Cessor incidents motivated all or in part by hostility to the victim's real or perceived race, religion, color, sexual orientation, ethnicity, ancestry, national origin, political beliefs, marital status, age, social and family background, linguistic preference, or mental physical disability are required to be reported as hate crime related.
Okay, so like, what does that mean? So it's we report it under Cessor, but are you saying that precludes us from using it as an enhancement to?
No, so
okay.
Cessor requires, if it meets that definition, Cessor requires us to report it as being hate crime related, which means we can give the enhanced penalty for it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just still learning. I appreciate that.
Member Vanos, follow up?
I just have one more
please.
one more question, and this is related again to page 54 to the restitution part. And I'll just say I would like to explore maybe using the acts of hate as enhancement to the. I'm just curious what the rest of the board members say. So, but yeah, ready to move on to this other question. Okay, so for restitution, so last time we talked about this, I guess my question is when you say payment plans or alternative forms of restitution, is that including, does that still only relate to property damage or yeah, does that still only relate to offenses relating to property damage? And here's what I'm asking. So I'm looking at I don't know who pulled the research about other counties' code of student conduct and how they use restitution. But for example, in Duval County, they say restitution is defined as a restoring of something lost or stolen to its proper owner. In restorative justice, this is used with the referred student making amends with the victim of their behavior. And so I'm just wondering if we are limiting restitution to only property damage, or we are kind of looking at this as a bigger restorative justice issue. Personally, I would like to see consequences more related to the offense. So that's why I'm asking this question. Does that make sense?
When you say more related to the offense, do you mean you think Duval's language is better language?
Well, I think it's more inclusive. So here, we're just allowing restitution as a consequence for damage to property. But what I'm asking is, can restitution be used as a consequence for other behaviors that are not related to property damage?
So if you are referring to the language in Duval, so it says that restitution is used with. So in that case, they're doing a restorative justice and they're also having the student pay restitution. So it's two different things. So they're having the student do both.
Okay, but I guess what I'm asking is, there are other counties, for example, where they're using restitution, but it's not just for property damage. Hillsborough uses it for dispute or horseplay. I guess what I'm asking is, are we just limiting that? Are we just limiting restitution to damage to property?
As we have it in the code now, no. That would be up to you guys on whether you want to limit it to just the damage and property.
Okay.
But as it is in the code that we presented that's before you, it's used, it can be used in any of the offenses level 1 through 3.
Dr.
Okay.
Vasquez,
So-
help us.
I'll give you, and maybe it's someplace else and I don't remember, but the way it's stated here, it references damage, right? Takes or damages school property or the property of others. So according to this, I'm interpreting that it is just for property. Is there someplace else where we? No.
You're
So,
correct.
yeah, so that is correct. I'm sorry. So the way it's written here, it would apply, yes, you're correct. It would apply only to those situations regarding theft. So that's where the takes comes from. And then if a student damages another student's property or OCPS property. So
Okay.
if they steal something and it's not returned, then they would pay restitution. That would be even if they steal something from OCPS or another student.
Got it. Okay, thank you. If we are going to have this in here, I would like to expand it so that it is not just limited to damage to school property, the property of others. I'm
So
just
that
curious
it
to hear what-
incorporates the concept of restorative justice.
Exactly, yes.
So we already have restorative justice in our code under the different offenses. And as we explained last time, restitution itself is monetary. So that's why we defined it. So that's why it would only relate to theft or damage to property, because restitution, as it is defined and as it is seen in a legal concept, applies to a monetary amount.
Okay, and then as long as that is an option for the other, and including for level 4 offenses, restorative justice is an option.
No, not for level 4.
Not for level 4, no.
Alkivia, could you scroll up, because it's restorative practices is right above restitution. There you go.
As a possible, as a suggestion for one way of making sure that's clear, the language says that there may be, and then we say payment or alternative forms of restitution that perhaps I'm not saying everybody's going to vote for it, but as a way of addressing that, it could say as an alternative form of restitution, restorative justice practices could, I mean, there's other forms, but that could be part of it, and just specifically state that that would be an approach. Your thoughts, Dr.
Thank
Beth?
you. All right, so okay, so for the level 4 offenses, right, which is what we're having a conversation, can you scroll so we can see what the items there are? Because I do believe restorative justice is already included in there to be able to be used either in conjunction with other consequences there, or maybe it's a standalone because there's specific circumstances surrounding an offense there. Okay. So just to recap, so we're all on the same page, when we were looking at restitution in the Code of Conduct, we really are talking about the legal definition that refers to money that is a result of damage to property. So a child could commit a level 4 offense, be sent to an alternative site, and in addition to that, if they damaged property, could also then have to do restitution for what they damaged. Correct? All right, and I think that may answer the questions on the table. When you look at restorative practices as it relates to restitution, that gives us the opportunity to look at restitution for offenses that it's not easy to quantify what the cost of restitution is because it's not quantifiable. And so I think that answers your question and takes into account what you're asking. If we need to further clarify or give further direction in the handbook where we talk about the offenses, we can do that, but it's already in there.
Okay, I think that answers my question. I'll doodle on it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Member Vanos. I tell you what, I'm queued up, but I think I have kind of lost my train of thought. I think just my input on this before we move on is that I understand the First Amendment right issue. I really don't agree with it, but I mean, I just think in the school setting, affecting somebody emotionally in our schools, whether you feel like it's a freedom of speech thing or not, I still feel like that's just not appropriate for kids to be allowed to do that. But I understand it's still a legal decision, and that's why I think that the language in here covers that very well. And I think, again, I think it works as a deterrent, but it doesn't allow us to prohibit someone's freedom of speech, and it leaves the general counsel in charge of making that determination. And I think that's highly appropriate. So I like the language. It's a little thing, and I think it's probably, it says when the victim, okay, probably is fine, but there could be multiple victims, and I would think in most cases there will be, if it's really thought to be, well, I guess a hate crime could be against one person, but, yeah. Pardon me? Victim or victims? Yeah.
We can add an S in parentheses.
Yeah. Because I do tend to think that this, to rise to a hate crime, it's this more generic thing. It's not one person versus another. It's one person versus as we talk religion and all these other things. So if we could put that S in, I would appreciate that. And if I think of what else was on my mind, I'll come back. Member Byrd.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just to continue on this discussion, Mr. Palmerini, so, well, first I want to say I agree with possibly taking it out of the offenses and adding it in that section that it is, that if it's found to be an act of hate, then it enhances the consequence. So I agree with that. But let me just ask another question about this. So it's to determine that something is an act of hate. It is based on the, and I know we had this discussion, so forgive me if we're repeating, but it's based on the offender's intention, what we think the offender's intention is, not the consequence of what they did to the people around them.
It is selection of the victim on the basis of a protected characteristic. So let me use the example from the Florida Supreme Court case that decided it. It was a fight during which the two persons that were fighting, the one who was hitting the other one referred to the other one as a Jew lawyer. He didn't seek out the person because the person was Jewish, but during the course of the offense, he was using the slurs of Jew lawyer against him. Florida Supreme Court says that doesn't qualify for the penalty enhancement because he wasn't targeted because he was Jewish. It just happened to be something that was said during the midst of the fight. Now, if he knew that the person was a Jewish lawyer and went out purposely trying to attack him because he was a Jewish lawyer, that would qualify for the penalty enhancement under it. So you would have to have some proof that the child targeted the other child, knew the other child was some protected characteristic, and went after them because of that. It wouldn't be during the heat of a fight or something like that, they utter something like that. That would not qualify under the case law.
Okay. So the writing of school newspaper articles that are offensive to an entire group, religious group, if they are written under the basis of this is political speech, then that doesn't matter. It's not considered.
So that's an entirely different question. That implicates the right of free press under the First Amendment. So under the United States Supreme Court rules or cases, the Kuhlmeyer case, because we run our student publications, we have the right to determine what goes in or does not go in the student publication. To use the example that you're probably thinking of, we probably should have exercised better editorial control as an administrative staff before allowing that to go in, to say, okay, we have one point of view here. Obviously, we should probably have the other counterpoint view here. Or maybe this isn't appropriate and we don't want to get into this because anybody looking at our student newspaper would reasonably think that we're giving it our imprimatur, to use the word in the case, or our approval, right? So that's a different scenario for publication in a student newspaper than we would be dealing with here.
Okay. Okay. Well, that answers it. It's such a difficult thing because I had conversations about this last issue that we had with the flag with rabbis and people in the community that were extremely offended, that thought it absolutely was an act of hate towards their community and thought we were absolutely wrong in saying it wasn't. So it's definitely a difficult thing to deal with, but I think doing an enhancement is probably the best way to go, and yeah, it's challenging for sure.
Madam Chair, may I?
Yes.
So I think I've had this discussion with all of you, but just to make sure it's worth it, that it bears repeating. On that flag, it said, "For they were the peacekeepers." That was written in there. That when we were reading that, and it wasn't just me in my office, I basically had all of our lawyers look at it. that was commentary that we thought that was directed at Israel's conduct in its war with Hamas and how it's operating. And that is something that is clearly the topic of conversation in the international community within America. How is Israel conducting its war? Is it doing things that don't do enough to protect civilians as part of its war effort? That's different to me than if they had written on top of the flag, "All Jews must die." That's a completely different analysis, and that's what the difference was when we were looking at that. "All Jews must die" clearly to me is an act of hate, right? For they were the peacekeepers, that is commentary on Israel's conduct of its war. And that's why that was the distinction that we drew. As you see, that is a very difficult distinction, difficult line to draw. And depending on where you fall on that side of the issue, you could think, oh no, they're clearly wrong. That's an act of hate. Why can't they see it? But the other side of the issue can say, no, that's clearly right. We have the political right to make a statement about how Israel conducts the war. That's the level of analysis that my office will have to undertake if you all adopt this as either an enhancement to the penalty or have it as a separate provision of the code. So those are the difficult questions we'll have to answer. Now, my office will answer it, and we'll do our level best. Sometimes you all will agree with our assessment. Sometimes you will not. But that is the difficulty, and it could open us up to First Amendment challenges. Just being transparent. If somebody doesn't like a determination we make, saying it's an act of hate, they'll say, no, I have a First Amendment right to make the statement, and we could be in litigation over it. So you all have to go into that with eyes wide open about the potential problems that this language can cause. But if you all say this is what we want you to do, my office will make the constitutional analysis, we'll go through it, we'll explain it to the board as to why we either made the decision that it is an act of hate or it isn't.
One more question. Okay, so if for this particular case, the law enforcement was there. Law enforcement made the decision it was not an act of hate. If the law enforcement had decided that it was, then they could have charged, right?
Yes.
Okay, so is it possible for us to put in our code if law enforcement determine it is an act of hate, then we...
You could, but let me give you some potential difficulties with it, right? Law enforcement could write a report that says we think this should get the enhancement to the charge, right? That has to go to the state attorney to make a determination. And the state attorney then has to determine whether or not he or she can prove that, that hate speech enhancement. They could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a high standard to prove. And so they could say, you know what, while we think we're 75% sure that it was hate speech, we're not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't know that a jury could find it beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're not going to engage in the enhancement. So now I have gotten a, recommendation from law enforcement that this should get the hate crime enhancement that the state attorney does not, in fact, adopt. So now we have charged this child with an enhancement under our code based upon a charge that ultimately the state attorney didn't think they had enough evidence to prosecute. That is a very difficult thing to sustain.
Okay, so that's not helpful. That was my question. If that would be helpful to your team, but that's not. Okay, well then I feel like it's an important thing to have in our code. In today's world, we're seeing more and more things that are bad, that are hurtful. There's an increase in hate speech going on. And so I think it's important for us to have something in our code about it. So I understand it's going to make your job a little harder, but I think that it's important. So I'm all in favor of having it in there.
Thank you, Member Byrd. Member Salamanca.
Thank you. John, so just clarification, acts of hate. So hate speech versus hate crime. Acts of hate, we're saying this is crime. Oh, how broad is this right now?
So what this is meant to do is it's meant to encompass speech that wouldn't be protected under the First Amendment, right? And so it's not saying it's necessarily criminal. They could be criminal, right? It could be criminal, depending on the nature of the offense, the context of it. But they're not, it's not a concentric circle. There's like some sort of overlap here where on the Venn diagram where, it could be a crime and it could be an act of hate, or it could be separate and distinct. So it really depends, once again, on the facts and circumstances of each individual case.
Yeah, I have a hard time with hate speech, and I wouldn't want us to be ruling on something wrong. Hate speech on its own, it's speech, right? So even just in the past board meeting, right, racial slurs. We had an example that came up on a racial slur, where 2 board members on this board disagreed if that was a racial slur or not. One of them would have said, I could have emotional suffering from this. And the other one said, no, I find it as a term of endearment. So I have a hard time among community, right? Not in that case, it was contextual, which is one of those things that's like, who are we to rule on this? And my biggest issue with this is, and this is what happened with our past case, you have administrators and teachers make the call of this is an enhancement or it's not an enhancement. Then it goes up to legal, or it maybe goes to law enforcement. Everybody has a different take on that enhancement. And any time that we undo that enhancement, it's going to come to this board. And it's always going to be political, because we are explicitly outlining things that will be in this gray line. We're saying race, color, religion, sex, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, language spoken, homelessness. Like, the things that are outlined here are controversial on their own, and how someone interprets that, hey, you hit me because of this versus their intention is an awful place to put our administrators. And also, I get our legal team. I understand that our legal team has the capacity to do this, but when I look at every law class, I was looking up like UF law, for example, there's like 4 classes on just the First Amendment, on how to interpret the First Amendment. It goes to say there are experts. There's entire Supreme Court justices who just focus their attention on the First Amendment because it is so difficult to interpret, and it is case by case. It is how did you say it? What was the intention? Do you have a history on your social media of saying this it's the racial slur and targeting people, therefore I can prove targeting? Like, the kind of legal burden that happens in real criminal court to prove acts of hate and speech, it is a really high burden. And if you are on the side where you felt that you had to take in the emotional suffering or physical injury, you're going to feel one way, and you're going to feel very strongly. And every time that there's some layer of authority, whether it's our legal team or our administrators or the state attorney that suddenly says, actually, this does not apply to you, it's going to end up here, and it's going to be political. And then all of us are going to have a statement, and all of us are going to have a point of view of if it is or it isn't. And so I think we corner ourselves into a really uncomfortable, like, the more we uniquely take this out of the code, we're saying we want to talk about this specific area when it comes to the code of conduct, rather than say it is vandalism, it is harassment, it is bullying, because our code of conduct does address and have consequences for those things. I understand that there are things that can be hurtful, but hurtful and emotionally suffering does not automatically mean that it came with the intent of hate speech or a hate act. It doesn't mean that I hit you or I bullied you because of your sexual orientation or your sexual identity. You might perceive that I said that to you because of your sexual identity. And there's going to be a lot of cans and worms opened when we say, I actually think you said that to me because of one pick. Go down the line and check mark of why I think you said something to me or why you broke my laptop. And then we have to take it case by case. Is that true? Is that not true? Our administrators we know even with not complicated things like this, how many times it can get complicated on the code of conduct. But any parent that sees this happen to my kid and that is checked, undoing that and saying, actually, no, just kidding, our legal team determined that case by case, actually, your kid did not suffer this, it's going to be really difficult position for our legal team, for the board. Like, these cases are just going to keep happening. I particularly would prefer if we did not have anything related to speech, because I think speech is an even bigger slippery slope than a crime. But I still think we're putting a very high legal burden that even legal scholars spend case by case debating for hours. And I don't know that that's our role. I understand the emotional components of it, but the reason why this thing keeps coming up right now in such a political world is because people do get offended and feel that they are personally targeted because of these things. And many times that is true, but many times it's not. Like, there are many times where folks have said things to me that I could have interpreted as due to my sexual orientation or my immigrant status or my language spoken, but I didn't take it as that. But I could, and I could make a whole thing out of it. And some folks are in very different emotional states when some stuff happened to them, and how they interpret and process emotional distress is different. So I personally do not want to be in the seat of interpreting this after our legal counsel provides some guidance and it continues to be appealed and it comes to us once again. I do not think I want to be in that role. So I prefer to remove this from the code of conduct. I understand if folks want to keep it as an enhancement, but even an enhancement, I find it to be difficult. But that's it.
Okay, thank you, Member Salamanca. Member Farrant.
Thank you. That was excellent explanation. I too have some serious concerns. Even when we look at the situations that we've dealt with this past year, it's very difficult, but as Member Salamanca stated, we live in an offended culture. We have created this culture where everyone is offended by everything. You could wear the wrong hat and people are offended, and hold the door the wrong way, people are offended. It's just a very offended culture. And when I look at all the other items, I cannot tell you how many parents I talk to who say, my child has been bullied at school. We made a claim. The claim comes back unfounded. Nothing happens to the other child. And then their child now has to decide if they want to move schools. If we can't even get that straight, this is going to be to me, we're doing this to appease the situation that happened, which was, in my opinion, was completely ridiculous. I'm very frustrated that a student would do that at school, and I hope that we can create a culture where everyone feels welcome at school and they feel it's a place where they can enjoy coming, that they love being there, and that we aren't taking the issues that are happening outside into the classroom. So to me, that's a matter of just creating a better maybe school culture. But to have acts of hate, my biggest angst is the emotional suffering part, because as we discussed, it is subjective. I think all of us have dealt with some sort of situation where people have been, attacking. I've sat here and had people come by the slews and said ridiculous comments. And I could sit here and say, well, I'm receiving emotional suffering. Those are acts of hate. Some of it we need to, just say, I pray for you and you move on with your life. In the cases that we've seen now, there were consequences. Mm-hmm. And so I think we do need to look back and say, the consequences that we have, we deal with that. And then if it is something where we go, hey, I think we need to have maybe the, the restorative practice then needs to be, that's where I think restorative practice can come into play, where we say, listen, you did this. We want to talk to you about what you did and how that actually can be interpreted by those around you and by the class of people that you did this, vandalism towards, or wrote the article towards. We have to think about, the golden rule again: do to others what you would want them to do to you. Would you want somebody to write an article that you would feel targeted about? Would you want somebody to take a flag that you find pride in and destroy it? So that, I think we need to look more at restorative practice and see how we can ensure that students are not just being told, hey, that was wrong, that was vandalism, or that was wrong, you did this, but how can we kind of just educate them in the sense of, just let's try to be kind to the world around us. We can have our own opinions, we can have our own thoughts and our free speech, if you will, but also knowing, like, at what point is it actually causing more harm than good. So I'm in agreement that I think I would remove the acts of hate, because after we've looked at it all, I mean, again, Mr. Palmerini, with the thing with the flag, say we had this acts of hate in here. Would that have been considered? Would they have been issued this?
No.
Okay, so done. So everything that we're going to get before the board that we all feel should be some form of acts of hate, we're going to be told, nope, sorry, legal team has looked it over, doesn't fit the criteria. And I think when it fits the criteria, it actually is the hate crime, hate speech, which is already something that is a criminal offense. So, I mean, I feel like we're doing this to make ourselves feel better, personally. It's, so I'm in agreement then to completely remove it and just make sure that we're doing more restorative practice to help educate our students and just create a better school climate within our schools.
Okay, thank you, Member Gallo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one of the questions I was going to ask, Alicia just asked Doctor. I'm elevating you, John. Mr. Palmerini.
He does have a doctorate.
Oh, so
degree.
I can call him Dr. Palmerini.
Yes.
No.
It's a Juris Doctor, but it is.
But that was one of the questions I was going to ask, is if this language had been in our code of conduct, would we have handled that situation differently? And you clearly said we wouldn't have. How does this language differ from our language around bullying? Like, what's the difference between our bullying language and this language? Do we have, like, emotional suffering in the bullying? Like, what does our bullying language look like?
We're pulling it up, but the bullying definitions are generally state statutory driven too.
Oh, still it's helpful.
Yeah, and psychological distress.
In our bullying language, do we don't list bullying in the form of, like, if we're bullying for religion, blah, blah. Like, I'm wondering if we could take part of the hate speech and incorporate it into the bullying, like, so that we're defining that it's bullying. Go ahead. I think the superintendent.
So the issue with that is that bullying is repeated, right?
Okay.
It's not like a one-time offense. And so that certainly we would be able to include that, but if it's not repeated, we would not be able to classify it as bullying.
So if it just were to happen one time, we wouldn't consider that.
Go ahead. Yes.
So to answer your question, you could have bullying, and it also could be a hate hate crime related. So that's part of the enhancements that we're talking about the state allows us to do. So through the investigation, if I bullied you based on your religion or your sexual orientation, then we could say, okay, we're going to check it as bullying, which is going to be the level 4 offense, but we also would check off that it was hate crime related.
It's still repeated, though. If it was
It's-
so if it was a one-time offense, we would deal with it.
As a harassment.
Not
Can we
bullying.
go to harassment?
All right, yeah, let's look at harassment. Because I agree that I'm not certain that the way we handled the flag situation was strong enough. But I also agree that putting language in that would not have given that incident any more teeth isn't helpful either. So, Chair, may I ask another question?
Follow up, of course. Thank you.
So harassment pertains to if you're harassing somebody based on religion, based on gender identity, based on ethnicity. No? Does that count? Would that be considered harassment? Or would that be bullying? I mean, if it's just a one-time offense where you're insulting or threatening or making fun of somebody due to their ethnicity or their gender identity, would that be harassment?
That would be harassment, and we will check off one of the other related items. So it could be harassment, and it could be disability related. It could be, I'm going to have Ms. Haynes maybe read the related items. She has that pulled up.
Yeah. No, but I'm asking about a one-time, like.
Yes, a one-time harassment could have a related item also.
Okay. Yeah. And then I guess my next question is pertaining to restorative practices. So what does restorative practice look like in our schools? Because I feel like many, many years ago when we first started talking about restorative justice and we implemented it into our schools, it kind of fell apart. I don't know if it was just we didn't do it with fidelity or what happened to it, but I'm not seeing restorative justice or restorative practices in our schools like I used to see when my kids were in school. When I go into schools or when we have conversations, it's rare that anybody brings up restorative practice. When I'm looking at the discipline matrix, it's rare or extremely uncommon for me to see restorative practice as the recommendation for the offense. So what does that look like? When would we use it? Is it beneficial? And do we have any data to back it up?
So when we look at restorative practice for our level 4 offenses, we're talking about the counseling sessions that we offer, some of the counseling opportunities that we offer kids. As it could be within the school or it could be outside of school. For example, we would consider a restorative practice if a kid has sexual harassment and they got our Stop and Think counseling program. Or if they are back on track, could be considered a restorative practice. Now, when we talk about offenses from levels 1 through 3, I will let Ms. Furno speak on how restorative practice looks at the school level. But when we're talking about our level 4s, we're talking about our counseling that the students are receiving.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It is something that we work very hard on in our department, and every school does have people trained at restorative practice. It's required that we have personnel at every school trained in restorative practices. We do use it quite often with students. Some of the things that came up here that we need to be aware of is that it's not required because sometimes the victim would choose not to sit down with their person that they felt harmed them. But we use it as a standard practice when parents and students are willing to come together. It's very effective. We use it sometimes in class meetings. We use it as individual students. and sometimes even with adults. And so it's a practice that we have people trained in every one of our schools. And there's also a disciplinary response in levels 1 through 3. It also is included in 4, generally less used there because of the sometimes imbalance of power between a victim. They choose not to sit down and have those conversations, which is very important because you have to be, in order to be successful with restorative practice, you have to be willing to sit down and address those issues. But it is used quite often. We do track that data on the referral under the response codes.
Do we see a reduced rate of reoccurrence with restorative practices when used well?
When it's used well, because sometimes it's used for discipline as a response to a referral, but sometimes it's used because we see a conflict or hear about a conflict. So it doesn't always relate to the code of conduct. It doesn't always relate to an offense. And what we find with the data and with talking to our students, that when they can come together and verbalize what their feelings are, it raises that empathy in students, because oftentimes students will say, I didn't know I was being mean, or I didn't mean to be hurtful. But when they hear it from someone that, yes, it was indeed, then yes, we cut down on those incidents.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Member Gallo. Member Byrd.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Ms. Furno, because I know one of my schools, they really focused on that last year, or the year before, actually, and they saw a great reduction in their referrals and their fights, and but they were doing it offense, and when they got conflicts, they were bringing kids together and having those discussions. So I love to hear that they're all doing that. Look, I think that the board's feelings are moving on this, which is fine. I mean, we obviously will go with what everybody says, but I still believe that our entire code of conduct is based on, makes statements for what the kind of behavior that we expect in our schools. And not all of them are easy to prove. Bullying is not an easy one to prove. I mean, like Member Ferrant said, how many times do we hear from parents that my kid's being bullied and the school doesn't do anything about it? So the bullying is not an easy thing to prove. That doesn't mean we don't have it in our code of conduct, that we don't want to see bullying happening in our schools. And, we expect our students to not fight. We expect our students to not disrespect teachers. We expect all of these levels of behavior, and I believe that we should make a statement in our code of conduct that we expect our students to not target other students based on their religion or their, gender identity or whatever. I think that those are important things for us to say. I think that that is what our code is for, to outline what we expect in our behavior. So I still believe that it needs to be even if it's just a separate statement that just says, maybe it's even talking about that that we have to report them. Assessor can have enhanced legal. Okay, then that's fine. As long as I don't know. I think the fact that it's hard is not an excuse to not have it. But
So I thank you for pulling it up. If you want to take a minute and look at your screen, we do have it. It's just not a separate item in the code. Certainly, this is something that when we do the code of conduct review, we can enhance what we say so our students are well aware that this is something that we're not going to tolerate. But it's in the code. And I think what is difficult about this particular item is that if a child invokes his freedom of speech, which is what happened recently, then it has to be treated as such. All the other situations that we have had, and we've had some, sadly, we have had students that have committed this crime, and they have been dealt with. But they were
sorry.
not determined to,
I-
I'm sorry.
You said something, but I don't think you finished your sentence. We have had students.
Students who have committed acts of hate, either physically or through speech, and they have been dealt with according to the code of conduct. And to my knowledge, I could be wrong, none invoked freedom of speech. So this is really the first time in how many years that we have been faced with the situation where the act was protected speech. But we certainly can enhance our, I think it's part of a Canvas course at the beginning of the year, and every time we review the code, that there is an entire section that speaks to this so that students understand that we are going to hold them accountable.
Okay, Member Douglas.
Thank you, Member Chair, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, sorry, I apologize. I do agree with Member Salamanca about removing the act of hate, because I really believe that it's a slippery slope. Really, the interpretation of that could have different consequences and could lead to negative outcomes. Especially in the classroom, we don't need to bring that burden to the principal and to the teachers on top of this, because I'm telling you, coming from the classroom, student will find any reasons to bring acts of hate, and it's going to be a really huge problem. So I really do believe that we need to remove that act of hate. Okay. Regarding the restitution, I have one question. Could we add that there may be alternative to restitution? Can we add that to your code of conduct? And some of the alternative could be community service or any other at the discretion of the counselor. Something that says at the discretion of the counselor. It could be monetary payment, you have to pay, or alternative payment, which could be community service, tutoring, whatever the counselor think will be needed at that time. Is it possible to add that? So it's a little bit more, detailed. Thank you.
Don't everybody answer at once.
We just pulled it up. I want to make sure that answers Board Member Douglas's question. The restitution, where it says can be arranged, could be payment plans or alternative forms of restitution can be arranged with the school principal. Does that cover it?
Yes, I will. Again, I just wanted to have a little bit more details on what could be some of the alternatives so the parents are aware of it. Community service, tutoring, etc., at the discretion of the counselor and the school principal.
Yes. We can add that in parentheses.
All right, thank you, Member Douglas. Okay, I may be just off track entirely, so bear with me. And bear with this cough. John, you said yours has been hanging around for 2 weeks. Mine's been hanging around for 2 years. It's called allergies, and it's a real pain in the neck. Okay. So, sorry. I guess I've got a question for Mr. Palmerini. So, we had a situation several years ago where a student referred to something in their graduation speech. I don't remember the specifics, but I remember it really rose to a lot of people's attention, and we adapted our practices to now, as I recall, this speech, graduation speech, has to be approved ahead of time. Am I correct? So just in the general concept of this freedom of speech, I'm trying to understand how, I hear what you're saying in terms of a publication, because we have ownership, if you will, of that publication. I don't know how we have own, and I'm not saying I disagree with the approach that we took, but I can't reconcile that we have ownership of what that student, by virtue of their status, that we normally would say, if you're a this or you're a that, you get to speak, but we get to determine what they say. Can you help me understand the distinction?
Yeah, so
Unless we just got it wrong.
No, the graduation speech is a little bit different. Now we have under the new statute that came out, the one that we just adopted the policy on, that says, a speaker's statement at graduation doesn't necessarily imply our endorsement of it. So that's a completely separate deal. So with respect to speech by students at school, it's the Tinker case, and it's best to go back to the original principles on this from 1968. So in that case, it was students non-violently protesting the Vietnam War with a black armband, and they got suspended from school for it. And that case went up to the United States Supreme Court and said, the Supreme Court said, students don't lose their right to free speech when they enter the schoolhouse gate. And what the standard is, and I have it here. So in order for the state, in the person of school officials, to justify prohibition of a particular expression of opinion, it must be able to show that its action was caused by something more than the mere desire to avoid the discomfort and unpleasantness that always accompanies an unpopular viewpoint. Certainly where there is no finding or showing that engaging in the forbidden conduct would materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the school, the prohibition cannot be sustained. So applying that language to the situation we had. That flag was up for...
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Are you going to come back to the speech?
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to get to that, okay.
Yeah. So applying that situation, this case to that situation, that speech, that flag was up for an hour, and it did not cause fights. It didn't cause anybody to get loud arguments, anything like that. Nothing like that occurred. A couple students saw it, brought it to the attention of the administrator. That did not cause a substantial disruption. And under the Tinker case, when it doesn't cause a substantial disruption, you generally don't get to regulate it that way. So that's the issue we have. Kids have the right to free speech, but if it causes a substantial disruption. So let's say the kid went out and said, I hate all Jews, in the middle of the courtyard, and all of a sudden you've got a massive fight that breaks out. We could penalize that because it did cause a substantial disruption to the operations of the school. But that's generally the test that has to be employed when we're dealing with student speech here. Go ahead. And
Can you read back? I'm so sorry, but
yes. No, absolutely.
Do better when I can.
So it says, in order for the state in the person of school officials to justify prohibition of a particular expression of opinion, it must be able to show that its action was caused by something more than a mere desire to avoid the discomfort and unpleasantness that always accompanies an unpopular viewpoint.
The action being the prohibition.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm following you now.
Certainly where there is no finding and no showing that engaging in the forbidden conduct would materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the school, the prohibition cannot be sustained. Prohibition being referring to the prohibiting the speech.
Okay, so the point being, if you are prohibiting the speech, but there is no other ramification that would trigger some other disruption or discipline, then you can't prohibit the speech.
That's correct.
Okay, so with that particular student, what did it cause that resulted in us taking away that freedom of speech of other students?
It did. No, we didn't take away his freedom of speech.
It said from not that one because it had been said, but oh no, they did, and that student got to read it.
So we did not penalize the student for the content of the speech. What we did penalize the student for was the vandalism of and the destruction of that flag. That's what I'm saying.
I forgot about. Okay, I am not remembering all real clearly. I thought it was a young woman, and I thought it had to do with. I'm talking about the speech.
Oh, you're talking. Oh,
I'm
you're
talking about the
graduation
speech. As I didn't know there was a flag. No, I'm back to the speech. I don't remember the speech having any of those consequences. I think she was actually, at the last minute, denied the ability, and we let her speak here.
Yes.
But at the same time, we then changed the process so that from that point forward, the speeches had to be approved.
Right.
Which meant that we are preempting freedom of speech. When on the previous case, we said, you're going to get to say what you wanted to say because we didn't have a practice in place to approve it. So I get where we can stop somebody from using our newsletter. I do not understand, based on what you're telling me about freedom of speech, how we can restrict a student's right to say what they want to say unless it results in something after the fact. So help me with that.
No, graduation. The law moved in that general time
Yes.
period too. So
You just told us that.
Yeah.
So can we still do what we're doing based on where the law
So
went?
under 1002-206, so it says the school district shall adopt a policy that establishes a limited public forum for student speakers at any school event at which the student is to speak publicly. So that is a graduation.
Yes.
The limited public forum policy shall require the school district to provide in the forum in a manner that does not discriminate against a student's voluntary expression of a religious viewpoint or otherwise permissible subject. Provide a method based on neutral criteria for the selection of student speakers at school events. So, and for our graduations, it's
Right.
the valedictorian,
Exactly. We've
salutatorian.
defined
That's neutral,
who
right?
is, yes.
Ensure that a student speaker does not engage in obscene, vulgar, offensively lewd, or indecent speech.
Okay.
So we can review prior to make sure that it's none of those particular things.
But we can't deny them the ability based on what you said before, okay? They can have their view.
Yes, they
Yes.
can have their view on a particular subject. Now,
Yes.
you know, obviously what we do when we talk with students who are doing graduation speeches is, hey, remember your audience, this is a celebration of, you know, everybody who's out here graduating. Maybe you want to tailor your message that way. So we work with the students to make sure that what they're doing is they're remembering why they're there, what the purpose of the speech is for. But if a student really had a strong opinion that I wanted to include something in this speech about some sort of otherwise permissible activity, they get to do it under this statute.
Okay, I appreciate that, but does that actually happen and do the principals know that? Because that to me is, I am still stuck in where we were, and I hear what you're saying. I don't know that I knew that statute was put in, and nor do I know that we now would allow a student to say something we didn't allow them to say that.
So that language that we read from actually is what's in our graduation policy. I'll circulate that after we get through
Okay.
here.
Okay.
It's in our graduation policy. So, and it's something that Mr. Martinez and his crew make sure when they're talking with their principals that they are well aware of. So,
Okay. Well, that helps me
Yeah.
reconcile those two issues. Okay, so coming back to that, couple of different questions. So, one of the things that I've heard by board members, and I totally understand the subjectivity of whether something is causing emotional distress or psychological distress, or whether or not it was intentional. I think one of the things, because I'd still like to keep the language in some form, is the use of the term intentional, which again is hard to prove, but it shouldn't be that someone did something having no intent to cause this effect, and it offended somebody, but it wasn't intentional. So I think intentional at the beginning of that obviously makes it much harder to apply, but it should be hard to apply because the very act of hate is intentional, right? I mean, you can't unintentionally hate. So I don't think it's inconsistent to say that if we're going to refer to it as an act of hate, it therefore has to be intentional. So anyway, I would suggest that we put intentional if we can keep it. there are things that I can think of. So if it was an Israeli flag, I know we talked about this before, but I don't remember the answer. Israeli flag, and somebody has peppered it with swastikas. I don't know how anybody could interpret that differently, but if we don't have this, other than the fact that I guess it would be vandalism, that would be the only thing it would be. So if it's swastikas on an Israeli flag, does that give you a comfort level that that would cross the line if we had?
For me,
Acts of
that
hate?
would cross the line because of the history of Nazi Germany with respect to Jewish people, and the fact that Nazi Germany was responsible for the extermination of 6 million Jewish people. The only way you could look at a Nazi swastika on the Israeli flag is, I hate Jews and I think they should die. That would be how I would look at it.
Likewise, when it's African American History Month, I'm not going to say what the graphic could be, but it's because it's just too hurtful and too, anyway. But so I think there are symbols that would clearly say this is hate.
So I'll give you the example. Then this actually went up to the 11th Circuit, Confederate flag. The 11th Circuit has said in a decision that you don't have to wait for the substantial disruption to occur with regard to the Confederate flag, because anybody, reasonable observer looking at the Confederate flag would predict that it would be disruptive, especially and offensive to the African American community, given what that flag symbolized. Now, that is the outlier case, because normally they have to allow the substantial disruption to occur before you take that act, but the 11th Circuit has blessed preemptive prohibition on the Confederate flag.
Okay. So a couple of other thoughts. We've talked about how hard it is to prove emotional suffering and how hypersensitive. And I had an example where somebody went to open the door for me, but I got to the door before he did, and opened the door, and I didn't have any idea that that was going to be taken as offensive, that I didn't allow this individual to open the door. So, I mean, that is just like how, like, I had to, you know, huh? Wow. I mean, I was like, please, I never would have done something to offend you. I just am used to opening my own door. But so, yes, we have a culture of hypersensitivity. I agree with that. But we also have, both in bullying and harassment, we have language that would... Oh, thank you. Who's thrilled? Somebody's thrilled. AI is thrilled to work with you. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, AI, but you were no help at all on the Israeli flag issue, and you obviously don't know what the red bloody hands means, so the heck with you. So, okay, I'm sorry. But we do use the term substantial emotional. We use the term psychological, and those are hard to prove, and they're very subjective, but we have used them in a lot of places. And subjective or not subjective, we still count that when it comes to bullying. So the idea that we have things in the acts of hate that are difficult to distinguish is not unique to a lot of things in our code. Dr. Vasquez,
So
please.
anytime we've included that, it's because it's in the statute. It's not.
Okay.
That's
Thank
why
you.
we include them.
Thank you, but then that brings me back to the point. If Florida statutes can say that we have to consider these things, then why would we be limited by taking it one step further and saying if it's an intentional act of hate against a group of people, that we can't say that that's wrong in and of itself. It has to trigger something else. And that's one, and again, I guess the legislature can preempt freedom of speech. Is that kind of how that works? No, okay. Okay, so help me out.
So the legislature and the State Board of Education, through the adoption of rules, and this will be funny later tonight, can adopt things that wouldn't necessarily stand up if challenged in court under the First Amendment, right? You all as public officials have to presume every enactment of the legislature and the State Board of Education is constitutionally valid until such time as the courts rule that it is invalid.
Okay. And we're protected
Yes.
from that standpoint because
Yeah,
we followed
so-
something we accepted as valid.
Well, it depends on the scenario.
Okay.
Right? So it depends on, I'm just going to throw it out here because it's the easiest example in the world to do, right? So we're currently being sued over the book issue, along with the State Board of Education. And what our defense in that case is, we are not substantively defending the law because we weren't responsible for passing it. So we said it is our responsibility under state law to enforce state law as drafted by the legislature. The state's position in the defense of the lawsuit is we are not responsible for this because it's the local school boards who are responsible for enforcing the law. Now, it's sort of a circular tautology, but given, direction from the state board, and the Constitution of the Florida Constitution, Article 9, Section 2 says the State Board of Education oversees the system of free public schools in the state. So you all don't have the ability to override the State Board of Education or the legislature when they make a pronouncement. The courts can say the State Board of Education or the legislature overstepped their authority under the Constitution by adopting a statute. But you all can't presume that the statute's unconstitutional. You have to act in accordance with it, or the rules, you have to act in accordance with it until the courts overturn it.
Okay. But isn't a component of that, I'm going off of recollection, but isn't a component of that not whether or not the law is constitutional, but whether or not we're applying it in a constitutional way?
So you have put your finger on is it facially unconstitutional, meaning there's no set of circumstances where it could be applied constitutionally, or is it unconstitutional as applied in a particular circumstance?
Okay. Let's go, if we could, to the language, kind of the overarching language, when we were talking about creating a culture, which I very much agree. Ideally, we would find a way to create a culture, but that's a lot easier said than done with 200,000 students. But that language about the unitary, it was up here a minute ago. Dr. Vasquez, you, I think, directed us to get to that. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Maybe it wasn't unitary, but it was like, okay, so this is under Parent Student Notification, Section 4. So when I read this, as a parent, it says that pursuant to JB, all students attending school in OCPS shall be treated according to a unitary code, which applies equally, blah, blah, blah. I read that, and I don't necessarily think that that means treated as in treated by each other, as opposed to treated by the school. And I recognize when I'm seeing this, I should be thinking that, but that's when I see that, that's not what I'm thinking. I don't think it's treated by each other. I feel like it's the school district has the obligation. And I'm seeing some nodding of heads that interpreting this the way you're describing its intent, I think we could change this language to make it more clear that all students attending shall be treated by each other, shall treat and be treated according to, I don't know. I just think we could improve on this to make it more clear. Because even though it makes this statement, at the end of it, if you take out all the stuff that we wanted to add, if you just leave what we have, because I thought that one of the points was we have this language and it's good enough without the additional language. But I'm not sure Yeah, I said treated and treat, but
So the policy certainly, it replicates, the language is replicated from our policy, JB.
But again, I mean, at a minimum, changing this language so that everybody who reads it realizes it's not, obviously, employees should follow this, but it is not directed at employees. This is directed at the way students should behave. Yeah. I don't have the exact language, but does that?
I'm
Yeah.
reading it, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. So our policy JB has the language in there that says all students attending in the Orange County Public School District shall be treated according to a unitary code which applies equally regardless of. So it's a direct quote coming out of language. What's in the policy, there's next is a grievance procedure for anybody who's claiming discrimination, any student who's claiming discrimination on one of these bases, right? JB, since it's JB, it's a student-centered policy. Now, I'm not going to have to look closer. Generally, I think it alleges if there's allegations of discrimination by school officials, teachers, support staff, that would be covered by this. I don't know if it specifically covers student on student. That's what I'm going to have to read a little bit further.
Right, and that's where that language doesn't suggest that. On the other hand, when I think about this is the student code of conduct, then it stands to reason this is the conduct of students. It's not how I'm treated, it should be about how I treat. And anyway, bottom line is understanding what this is supposed to mean. I think changing this language to make it more clear that it's not the expectation that parents have of the school district, but the behavior we expect of our students in school. And we did call it, based on the underline and strike through, it did originally say hate speech.
Yes.
Well, okay. Yeah, I think we discussed that. It's just, okay.
Yeah.
So I'll move on because I think I wanted to get those thoughts out. And I'm sorry for taking so long. Member Vanos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll actually just stay on policy JB. And I guess my question, I guess we're determining whether it applies student to student, and so then we're also determining whether there are consequences to that, right?
So, can I give you just a basic overview of it? So with respect to student-on-student discrimination, normally, students don't have authority over other students to, for JB covers institutional discrimination against students, right? Normally, students don't have the power of the institution of the district to discriminate against each other. But if you go look at policy ADD, our bullying and harassment policy, that talks about student-on-student discrimination. So, for example, if you go to policy ADD, I'm sorry, I'm just pulling it up right now. When it defines bullying, it talks about systematically or chronically inflicting physical hurt, psychological distress on one or more students or OCPS employees, and it talks about, it further defines unwanted and repeated written, verbal, or physical behavior, including any threatening, insulting, or dehumanizing gesture by a student or adult. And then it gives examples of what would be considered bullying: teasing, social exclusion, threat, intimidation, stalking, physical violence, theft. And then it says sexual, religious, or racial harassment. So while it wouldn't necessarily be covered by policy JB, sexual, racial, or religious harassment would be covered under the bullying and harassment policy. That's where you would typically deal with it.
Okay. It's just confusing. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like it's just confusing because all these different parts aren't different policies, and it's sort of like hard to understand how they all work together.
Some of this is the vagaries of state law. We are required to adopt a bullying and harassment policy, and we are required to utilize the language that they utilize with respect to what is defined as bullying and harassment. So we have to do policy ADD separately, which we have done. But we also want to make sure that the institution itself is not engaged in discrimination. So that's why we've adopted JB.
Okay, that makes sense. Just going back to the earlier conversation, I'm kind of along the lines, I would say, with Member Jacobs or Chair Jacobs and Member Byrd. I think it's important that we have something in our code to reflect this. And I know we keep talking about the previous incident and how this wouldn't have applied to the flag incident, and even I think the parent who came up to talk about it, I mean, her main point was just like, let's have a conversation, right? I mean, even if we're not changing that specific outcome, or it wouldn't have changed that specific outcome, it's about a bigger picture, and it's about raising awareness about an important issue. And I do understand that the emotional, going back to the trying to determine someone's emotional impact or distress. And I understand that that's hard. I also agree that that's not a reason, not to do it, especially when we have reasonable fear and psychological distress in our harassment and in our bullying offenses. I do wonder, though, maybe a way that we could think about this is if we, and Chair Jacobs kind of alluded to this, like what we're really focused on is the behavior of the perpetrator. So, maybe if we talk about an enhancement or an act that's related to their intent, and we don't even, because really, I don't know that it matters what the victim is they can feel their feelings, right? But really what we're trying to stop is, or we're trying to highlight, or we're really honestly just trying to educate is, talk about is the intent of the person doing the act. And I'm less concerned about speech and words, and more concerned about offenses that are committed with an intent to focus on a particular person because of the particular class they're in.
Intent's always the hardest thing that we have to determine when in law. So, just using the legal standard that we generally use, there's direct evidence of intent, which is, I hate all Jewish people and that's why I did this. That would be direct evidence because they've said it directly out of their mouth and there's no question as to what the intent is. Then there's the circumstantial evidence. So I heard somebody else talk about how would we determine that? Well, if a kid makes a statement that's against some sort of certain religion, and then, and the victim says, by the way, I'm friends with this person on Instagram, or, they're my friend on TikTok, and here's evidence of, anti-African American, sexual orientation post that this kid has made, then you can use that evidence as circumstantial evidence of the person's intent. That's always, the circumstantial evidence one is always the hardest one because they'll come in and say, that's not my intent. And so you can say, well, but I have 15 posts where you make African American statements or woman statements here. That pretty much gives us evidence that that is your intent. It's circumstantial evidence of it. So it's going to be a case by case. What do I have in the file? What can I think I can comfortably prove under a preponderance of evidence standard, which is what we use in student disciplinary cases to determine whether or not I can show that there's intent there. But it's hard without having evidence in front of me to say, there's no hard and bright line rule.
Yeah, I get that. But I think a lot of times, and when we are determining discipline in our code, it's often based on circumstantial evidence. It's based on what these students said happened, like what their opinion of this event was. So we don't cross-examine people in our discipline code. It's, unless someone admits to something and discloses their intent or discloses that they did, X offense, it's really often circumstantial evidence, right?
I disagree with that. I do think that there are some cases where if it's a he said, she said, and in most of those cases, we give the benefit of the doubt to the students being accused so they don't even receive the consequence. We typically look for hard and fast evidence, whether that is witness statements. It's actually why we pursue the person that's being accused. Is there anyone you want us to talk to? Is there anything you want us to look into that would prove your innocence? So I don't agree with that statement. I think that there are some that are difficult, but most of them are not.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess those are just my comments. I guess I would just say if we're concerned, and I hear Member Ferrant and Member Salamanca's comments about, hard to determine someone's emotional suffering, but I think that we can focus more on the intent of the person, and I know that is hard too, but I feel like I think that is doable, and I think maybe that's a way we can still recognize that these acts of, that these acts of hate speech or acts of hate are not tolerated in our schools, and I do think that's important.
Thank you, Member Vanos. Oh, it's me. Oh, I don't know how I got back up. So quick. Member Felder up next? Oh, I'm sorry. I just usually click myself off. Thank you. I forgot to click myself off. Thank you, Member Felder.
What an engaging conversation here today. I'd like to thank our Miki and her team and for your work, and of course, John, you're such an astute Juris doctor of law. We thank you. And I'm listening to all of my fellow board members, and this is going to take greater discussion. And we have deliberated quite a while. But I do want to say in defense of the restitution policy that this district has adopted, and I have to go back to my frame of reference. I have to draw from that. As a teacher at Edgewater, it worked very well. Because you're right in saying that sometimes parents, the children that are involved may not want to do that. So we have to have in policy a fresh alternative in the event that they don't want to do that. But if it is done right, and it was at Edgewater, administration was on board, and when you got the students by themselves, aside from the crowd and so forth, it was the problem was so minuscule and minute. I mean, they were able to get along and do this correctly. I do understand the discussion about the language and what is really hate speech, and that, again, because of our expertise here on this board, because we were elected in this position based on the fact that our constituency believed that we had the ability to successfully advocate for them. With that being said, we have clarity, intention. And I know you all, my fellow board member, Maria Salamanca. Salamanca, yes, I got it right. Salamanca, yes. Yes, Salamanca. We do, we agree to disagree. And I appreciate your respect from that end, Maria, about this whole thing about term of endearment. But I think if we continue to just divvy on that, we will run ourselves in a foxhole, as I said some time ago when we talked about this, because of the music, because of the colloquialism that our students have adapted based on their environment where they are. And, it would just, we would be back up here constantly talking about offense. However, I do think that we have to make sure that our students do have the opportunity to practice fair speech, but because we're educators and it is our appointed duty to instruct and teach, there's certain things we must let them know. You can't do this. This is not the right thing to do. Even though you have the desire to express yourself, and we wanted you to have this free speech, but there are certain things you can't say. You have to have respect for other people's religious beliefs, their sexual orientation, and their racial identity. You just have to respect that. That's the thing that defines you as human and growing up into adulthood. So it is our duty to teach them because they don't know. We must remind them. This is why we create the policies for them. I'm hoping that as we continue with this deliberation, that when we put together the policies that, and I think someone mentioned it, I don't know if it was Member Byrd, that parents making sure that they really understand this language. I think that's what's important. The parents must understand, or the legal guardians must understand what we're trying to say to them with regards to the policy that they and their children must follow if they're going to be a part of Orange County Public Schools. It's important that we make that clear. I just want to ask one question. I think you probably already talked about it, and it's probably because of the way it is. Board Member Angie Gallo was telling me, this thing on hate, acts of hate, when you talked about shall be treated according to unitary code, which applies equally regardless of race, color, religion, age, sex, national origin, marital status. Okay, are we talking about, because our children sometimes go to VOTEC schools, there are adults there, but the children are not married. Is that just a standard thing?
Mr. Pomeroy.
So sometimes we do have emancipated minors who are married under the age of 18, so that would cover this.
All right, thank you. I knew that was an answer. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, well, I finished. I just wanted to express those points that I made, and thank you.
Thank you, Member Felder. We have a couple more board members scheduled. I do want to just comment on one thing. We have had a work session where we were missing one board member, and we tabled this, if you will, till the next work session where we were missing another board member, that being me. I would encourage the board to try to land the plane. This is only a work session. It's not a final decision, but I would like us to come out of here with some direction, even if it's 2 directions, so we can move forward. But let me defer to the superintendent on your thoughts on this as to whether or not we should walk out of here with the goal of having another work session, right? Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honestly, I believe we've beat the horse enough, but I'm more than welcome to hear other comments. It's clear that there are some board members that believe that without the language, we will not be able to effectively deal with acts of hate. Others believe the language is in there. And so after the comments, I would appreciate if we just took a vote or an informal showing, reach consensus so that the team can make those final changes. We don't anticipate that there's going to be anything from the state that's going to impact our code, so that we can actually have it ready to go before the start of the next school year. So I appreciate you asking us to land the plane.
All right, thank you. Member Ferrant.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, can I just add one thing
I'm sorry,
to that?
please, Mr. Pomeroy.
Just for the board's awareness, we have a rule development workshop on this policy next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday. Thank you for that reminder.
So we need to have language to have that done.
Yes, and I think the word consensus, I believe, legally is unanimous. Am I right? but that's not how we mean it here.
No,
Yeah.
I just
general
one way or
direction, yeah.
one way or the other, what the
Yes,
direction
I
is.
agree. All right, thank you. All right, I'm sorry. Member Ferrant, you're recognized. Then
Thank
Member
you, Madam
Salamanca.
Chair. So I continue to think, really from the discussion that we've had, so my vote is to remove it from the code because it's just, to me, there's too much gray area, and if it is something that would be considered an act of hate under this code, it would actually, from what I'm hearing, would be a hate crime or hate speech, according to what Mr. Palmerini has mentioned. And so if that's the case, maybe there could be a statement that says acts of hate, that you could be prosecuted by the law under acts of, or the hate speech, hate crime, and kind of define that. But that we don't tolerate acts of hate, and that you will be one of the other, because bullying, harassment, all the other incidences that we've discussed. I would love to see at the beginning of our code of conduct to have something that says a golden rule statement. Here in OCPS, we strive to do to others as we would have them do to us. And that, before you do anything, think to yourself, is this something I would want somebody to do to me? And then move forward. Because that really is what we're, in the grand scheme, that's what we're all sitting here talking about. What would we want done to us? What would we want, what do we want to teach our students that when they get out of our school, anything that you're doing, if we're teaching them this, and it's in every classroom, the golden rule, the more you push that on kids, the more they go, what is what I'm, maybe they would think twice. So to me, that's even almost restorative practice in itself. That would be my suggestion, is to have some sort of golden rule statement and really kind of push that and remove the whole acts of hate from the, I like it in the section 4, parents and student notifications, acts of hate, kind of define that a little better. That says, if you are found to be, to have done a hate speech, hate crime, that is something that can be prosecuted under the law. And so maybe have it a little more defined there. Otherwise, I think it can be more confusing and cause more issues with having it within our code.
All right, thank you, Member Ferrant. Just a technical clarification, I think the board knows, but we're not going to actually vote, so giving your opinion on this at this point in time is very helpful. Yes, I know it is. Yes, Member Salamanca.
If the board really wants to have this, my main thing would be, I would want to see it as an enhancement, not as a whole standalone. I think a whole standalone is a pretty high burden of proof. I know that the definition of bullying and harassment that comes from state is fluffy and gray, which we constantly are frustrated with when the state does fluffy gray policy. So I don't like to then use that as an excuse of like, well, their stuff is poorly defined, so why don't we also do poorly defined policy? I hate bad policy. I hate policy that is hard to enforce. I hate policy that when it goes down to our principals and our teachers, is setting us up for more gray zone. So like, sure, the state is broad in its definition of bullying and harassment, therefore we should do broad hate speech and whatnot, and let's see if we are violating constitutional First Amendment or not. So I don't have that comfort. I do believe in free speech. I believe that depending on what the issue is, and that's what the court case said. John, could you remember the popular part of it, that it was like the 2 lines on the popular, it's like whatever their opinion is popular.
Yeah, students don't lose their right to free speech at the schoolhouse gate, and something more than a desire to avoid the discomfort and unpleasantness that always accompanies an unpopular viewpoint.
Yeah, so I believe there's many unpopular opinions depending on what the day is in this political world. And I think people fall on different parts of a popular or unpopular opinion, whether it's Israel and Gaza, Palestine, even the definition of what you can call it is unpopular or popular. I think to remember Felder's point of belief, right? It all comes down to what I believe, and we must teach kids what is good or bad, and their belief system is, let's say it wasn't an Israeli flag. Let's say it was an LGBTQ flag with blood all over it. And there's people out there that truly believe that is a crime against God or a crime against religion. That is their belief. I am no one to tell them what they should believe. And just because one is more popular or not, or one is more acceptable or not, I don't like to be in the gray zone. And I think for me, when I think of policy, and my role is to do policy making, not just like I want to teach kids, values, because I think that's really hard to put ourselves in. Of course I don't want disruption, right? So I can create a policy that says if you create disruption, there will be consequences to disruption. That is the consequence of something you did. That is a clear policy, right? It's an observable thing. You disrupted or you didn't disrupt, therefore I can create a consequence for it. But you hurt someone, or your intent was to do something, when in criminal law, like prosecutors spend so much time collecting evidence to prove intention. It's social media history, it is witness statements, it is all this stuff. I have a hard time saying I'm going to put that burden of the work on teachers and principals to define that this is an act of hate. And then if they get it wrong, I'm going to put that burden on this board to decide the case by case of, is that flag on the LGBTQ popular, unpopular, hate speech or not hate speech? Because it depends. You can pick. Right now it could be immigrants. Immigrants are criminal. That's a statement. It's free speech. Is it full of hate because you might hate criminals? You might hate, therefore, immigrants? Maybe. I don't want to be in the position to be making those value decisions. So, of course, should we teach people don't do bad things? Of course. And that's why we have a code of conduct that explicitly says if you do certain things, there are clear consequences. But to the superintendent's point of view, the more we can stick to policy that is both fact-checked and clearly defined and observable to then punish a student because we have proof, that's great. I don't like to be on the state side of thing of like this fluffy definition of gray. Let's just do more of that fluffy definition of gray and figure it out as it comes. So I just think that just puts us in like a really uncomfortable situation as a board. So if this board still wants to keep it, that's fine. I'm not for it. And if we do keep it, my only thing would say, can we have it as an adjustment to an observable thing? So if a student did create disruption, and on top of that, it was some form of hate, then that is an enhancement to the policy, but to the consequence. But like a standalone acts of hate of speech on the code of conduct, I have a lot of discomfort in, and I do not feel like it is. Maybe the state would defend it on first speech. I wouldn't feel comfortable in saying that I am protecting as an elected official the First Amendment. That would be my opinion.
All right. Let me respond to that, because I definitely understand what you're saying about the state creates fuzzy stuff and we complain about it, so let's not double down on it. As a parent and a member of the community, when I see that we have these others, but this doesn't rise to that level, I don't know that the message to our students, to our families, is the same when they see these are subjective, but this one we're not going to have. I gave some thought to your concept of attaching it to, and was even wondering if there would be a way to modify this language to say that when it results in one of these, which is kind of the same thing as tagging it on to the end, but it's a little more prominent, and I could definitely support that. I will say that we're still going to end up in that gray area, whether we attach it to or we attach those to the fuzzy gray area that you're concerned about will always be an area we're going to wander in, which is true of a lot of our code. So anyway, so that So let me hear from, we still, I still prefer the language that we have here, but I think that there should be consistency between the language we're putting in the actual code and the notification, because it is slightly different. Kind of says the same. This says it occurs when a student intentionally selects. And the language that we're talking about in the code, if you read it carefully, it says repeated acts, by the way, it says repeated under the acts of hate, when I thought we were talking that bullying requires, anyway, it says repeated acts or attempted acts to cause. So when it says to cause, that means it's intentional. But I had to go back and read that relative to this. So the language that we have under level 4 doesn't say repeated. If we add this here, it doesn't say repeated. I'm not saying it needs to be repeated. I just think it should be consistent. I actually don't think it has to be repeated, because if it were something so flagrantly obvious to us, example being Israeli flag, swastika, I don't think it has to happen more than once. So I don't think I'd put repeated, but I do think I would make that intentional very, very prominent, because of all the comments that you all have made. We discipline people not for how somebody else feels. We discipline people for what they do. That's the act of discipline. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I hope that maybe gets us closer to landing the plane without there being a swing vote. Actually, we won't have one because we don't have all the board members here. So I don't see anybody else wishing to speak. Member Douglas, where are you? Okay. Yes, Dr. Vasquez.
We need to clarify why one is singular and the other one is not. There is a difference. I believe it's because of the level of the offense, but.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Correct. So there was a level 3 in which it happens one time, and then if it happens again, it would be a level 4 offense.
Perfect. Then
So that's why I
the
said
only
it's
other
repeated.
observation I had was, like, instead of it saying 2, if we could just make it more clear that it's intentional. It says it. We can leave it the way it is. It says it. You just have to read it carefully. I didn't read it carefully. Forget I just said that. Okay. Erase the last 30 seconds of the tape. Any other board members have comments? Okay. Direction moving forward. Member Gallo, we're keeping this language that we have, or we're removing the language? Your thoughts on this?
So I understand the concerns surrounding this, and I understand Board Member Salamanca's worried about burdening our teachers and staff with language that is not clear. However, once an incident happens, it's usually reviewed by our discipline team. So really the burden's going to fall more on our discipline team than on our school staff. So I'm kind of struggling here because I agree with Member Bird's sentiment that we put in the student code of conduct, the code of conduct that we expect to see out of our students, our expectations of how they should behave, how they should treat one another. So I'm kind of on the fence. I think that we do need to have something, and I'm fine if we want to put it at the top, but there needs to be something in the code of conduct on our expectations and our zero tolerance on the acts of hate. I don't know that that was helpful, but that's where I am.
That was kind of helpful. Yeah. Member Vanos.
Sorry, I feel like I talked a lot, but I just wanted to be clear. I think that this is a tough one. There's a lot of things to think about, and I'm thinking about all of them. I think where I'm coming down right now is that we need to have something. And right now I'm probably leaning more towards the enhancement, sort of the enhancement of an offense. So that's where I'm leaning.
So in doing that, this language could be amended to say an act of hate occurs when a student intentionally selects a victim because of blah, 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 blah. And then it would list the types of things that would result from that that would already be covered in other areas of the code. Member Byrd.
So if we took it out of the actual code as an offense and left it here in the notification part as an enhancement, then we would state that in here. So we need to change this language then to say that it would result in a higher level discipline.
And we could still keep in the code acts of hate, but define in there that it's an act of hate when it, and then we would identify when it is destruction of property. In the context of another. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It would have a standalone place where you would see it, but it would tie back to another discipline. Yes, Dr. Vasquez.
So I'm very confused.
Okay.
I thought I was on the same page. So I heard enhancement, but then I heard keep it in the code. So what I originally thought is that we would not have it as a standalone, that we would enhance the language that we have, where we have here section 4, to include that if this would result or would be in effect if you had another concept. We could specifically list examples of what that would be, but that it would not be part of the code. But that's not, that I don't think that's what you just said. So I want to make sure that
That is what I thought, but then the chair said that we would have it in the code listed. So,
because I actually thought that Member Salamanca and I maybe had found a compromise, and I knew that I had folks over there that weren't comfortable, and we have folks over here, just happens to be one side or the other, that want it out, some want it in. So, go ahead.
No, so maybe, if you don't mind, let's first see if they're in favor of having it as an enhancement. And if we get consensus around that, then we can look at what that verbiage would be, where it would be placed, so that it's clear. Because it's two separate things, separate or an enhancement.
Mm-hmm.
But the separate could be an enhancement because it would only be triggered if it.
I need to define what separate means, that it's not part of the consequences it's currently listed. I'm doing this with my hand to try and have it scroll.
So I guess the question would be, do we want it as an offense, as a
Yes.
level 3 or a level 4? Or we're going to add more to the definition that we have in section 4 on the parent and student notifications?
Member Salamanca?
Yeah, so when I was I'm against having it, but if we have it, the way we find the compromise was that enhancement. And when I was thinking about enhancement was at the last meeting, John, and this is more like the criminal case of enhancement. So in criminal law, when someone commits a crime of hurting someone, of vandalism or something, that's one crime. Then it gets enhanced to a higher penalty, perhaps, because it has the additional hate component. But it's not, and I guess in the standalone version is like, let's say I don't do any of the above, like I don't vandalize something, I don't bully someone, I don't harass someone, but I say something, or, I mean, it's broad, that is considered an act of hate. The question would be, is that on its own a standalone thing? Even though they didn't do anything else, are we good with one, like the only thing they did is just acts of hate, and that's why it is the whole standalone, right? Like right now, any of these things can stand on their own and receive consequences. And so what I was saying is, I don't like this as a standalone as the only thing to receive a consequence for, because I think that in order to have this effectively done, ideally it is already on top of something else that is more observable and proven, right? They vandalize something, they hurt a kid, right, they punched them because of this. So my whole thing is on the I'm saying that we don't want to encourage it, so there should be a more severe punishment if that is the enhancement we agree on, but it would be on top of, not a standalone. But does that make sense on the?
Yeah,
but
it does.
I don't know how. I defer to staff on how that is structured, because I don't know that we have enhancements anywhere else in the code of conduct necessarily. So this would be kind of like the first time that we don't have like a standalone, but an enhancement. But that is a little bit more parallel to it. It is actually done in the law, right?
And
Mr. Palmerini?
may I suggest, like, so just as an example, we have destruction of property, vandalism, let's say, and a level 2 is under $100, right? So let's say we have somebody who breaks, I'm just making it up, like a game or some sort of electronic item that's under $100. But they did it because, hey, this kid's Jewish and I don't like him and I wanted to break his stuff. There is a level 3 vandalism that usually deals with property that's above $100 but below, I think, $750. Are you all saying that if you can prove that they broke this kid's electronics because the kid was Jewish or African American, to take that level 2 from a level 3? Is that what is that where the board is? That would be an enhancement.
So, I can only speak for where I am. I think you can accomplish the same thing by identifying acts of hate as a separate standalone that I see it. Acts of hate would include the same things that we would include for harassment, for vandalism, for all those other things that we were going to make this enhancement. We would say that an act of hate is when, and then it would list that the victim is selected based on da-da-da-da-da. And then it would be all those other things that it has to trigger. So it would have to result in a destruction of property. It would have to result in a meeting the qualification for harassment. It would have to trigger one of those other, but it wouldn't be an add-on perceived that when somebody looks at it, they don't have to like go, oh, wait a minute. They actually do care about when this is basically a discrimination, because that's kind of what we're saying. You have all these violations. This is about discrimination and a violation. But when you put discrimination and individual violations, I don't think that that strikes me as discrimination is a bad thing, as opposed to, oh, it's an afterthought. It's about it's about appearance, how people perceive our priorities, and I think our priorities are pretty high when it comes to discrimination, above bullying one person versus bullying a whole sector of our population. Bullying's a really hard one, but
So, yeah, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. So I'm confused, and so I just want to back it up a little bit. My understanding was that we would take it out of the levels, have a separate section that would delineate what the board is asking for with the specific, examples. But now we're back to, it would be part of one of the levels.
so I actually, what you just said, that it would be a separate section, what I was hearing was it will fall under, whether it's destruction of property, you'd have maybe a level 2, but if it meets that it's a discrimination against a segment of our population, then it would be a level 3. So that there's not a separate, it just gets enhancement. Yeah, it is just, from my standpoint, it's just about whether you call attention specifically to an act against a segment of our population that triggers something else, has its own place in terms of seeing it, versus read the fine print and you'll see that, yeah, you it was destruction of property, so it's a 2. It's a destruction of property, but it's against a segment of population, it's a 3. Bullying is a 2, but if it's against, it's a 3. So you can do it that way, and I think that was Member Salamanca's suggestion as an enhancement. I'm saying I think you can get to the same place by defining whether we call it an act of hate or discrimination against, whatever you want to call it, that it has to trigger one of these other violations. Well, you can remove it, you can put it in as an enhancement and list it each time, or you could define it here, but it only is triggered if it hits one of these other areas. Again, it's, what I'm arguing is we get to the same outcome. I just think a more prominent position is that you see it here, you recognize that it has to also meet the definition of bullying. You anybody got a, yeah.
So,
And then I will give up after this.
okay. So the last part where you're saying that it has to trigger something else, it wouldn't be possible for us to then code it as acts of hate, because if we're saying it meets bullying and then it's hate crime related, per assessor, we're going to have to code it as a bullying offense. Does that make sense?
Is there a,
And the enhancement would be bullying, but it's hate crime related per assessor.
okay.
So in order for us to,
Does Cesar have a definition associated? I thought you said it did to hate crime.
yes.
Okay.
So, but so the way you explained it, and
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that you would like to keep the offense, but it would have to trigger, for example, bullying.
Yeah.
But if it triggers bullying, then per state statute, we have to code it as bullying
Okay.
with a hate crime. We wouldn't be able to code it as the local offense.
Okay, but if it's defined as hate crime, you have to code it hate crime, correct?
So if it's bullying and we find that it's because of a protected class, then yes, we would code it as bullying with the hate crime related offense.
Okay.
With hate crime related
If it's not
enhancement.
bullying and it's just hate crime, do you have to code it as hate crime?
So, okay, sorry.
So does Cesar have a separate and distinct code for hate crime?
No.
Oh,
So,
that's what
yeah.
I'm sorry. I must not
Yes.
ask the question correct. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So we would either have to code it as our local offense, acts of hate, but if we're saying that, no, this is bullying, and they were bullied based on a protected class, per assessor, we would have to code it as the bullying and not as our local code.
One more follow-up, but Cesar does recognize hate crime.
So they would have a bullying, you would code it primarily as bullying, but then it would be hate crime related.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. I would be fine with that. Member Byrd?
Can I ask a question that'll, I think, clarify maybe? So we could take it out as a separate offense, but on our referral form, there could be another box to check hate related. This
Yes.
is hate related. And then in our parent notification is where we say, we are required, just like we do for the other assessor things, if a offense is hate related, then it will be reported as. Right.
Madam Chair, may I? We
Please.
have that already.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going back to what is probably not a popular comment, but we're going round and round trying to deal with a situation that was political speech. Okay, we're there again. And so I just want us to be able to try and land the plane with what you want us to do. We currently do have what Board Member Byrd was describing. In the, if I'm mistaken, please let me know, where we have had situations where there have been hate speech, we've been able to deal with it with the current code of conduct. And I know we've had, sadly, we've had more than a handful of those situations. So maybe it would help if we could better understand from the board what it is that you're wanting us to capture that's currently not in the code. And I think maybe that's where I'm struggling, because I think what we have talked about, we capture in the code currently.
Member Vanos?
I am not going to attempt to speak for everyone here. I think what I am trying to capture is drawing attention to the fact that we do not accept, these offenses that are perpetrated based on, one of those classes that we've described in this code. I think it's bringing attention that we don't accept this. And so right now, like you've said, we have had these issues, but we haven't really drawn attention to them. And so I think we need to make sure that students understand that this is, that if the offense is directed to someone based on the things that we've outlined, that there will be enhancement to the consequence that is currently in the code. That's what I am seeking.
As long as it's not deemed, excuse me, Madam Chair,
go ahead, please.
as long as it's not deemed political speech.
Correct.
Okay.
So, Dr. Bass, you say we have that in the code. Where is it in the code?
Yeah, go ahead, Demiki, would you?
So within our offenses, for example, you mentioned destruction of property. If we determine that they destructed the property based on hate speech, then we could check off, I'm just going to say maybe it was a level 3 offense. It'll be a level 3 offense, and then it would be hate crime related. So we do have related items.
So I'm asking you, where is that in the code?
The related items are not in the code.
Okay. So when you
want
say-
those definitions in the code is what I guess.
Well, yeah, the point is, if you're saying you're doing something, but I don't see it in the code, I don't understand how you can say you're doing something that's not in the, I know what you're saying, but I should see that in the code. And,
Okay, we can add those related items. We can add that to the code.
but we've been doing that all along. We've been enhancing the discipline without it being in the code.
Well, it's, no, go ahead.
I think you guys are using the term enhancement. It's not enhancement. It's just because hate speech or hate crime is not an offense. But if you determine one of the offenses that's listed in our code is related to hate speech or hate crime, we have to report it to the DOE.
And do we have a different consequence?
No, we do not have a different
I'm
consequence.
still troubled that we are reporting something to DOE that we haven't defined and we haven't listed. If we have to report it as hate speech, why is it that in our code we don't explain what that is? It's not even listed. I don't get this. I mean, and what we have under the parent notification doesn't tell me anything close to that. I don't get the feeling that this is about what a student does. It's more about, it's the language we picked up about the rights of students in our policy.
So when a parent looks at their student profile, what they're going to see on their student profile is the offense from our student code of conduct. The related items comes from Cessor.
I understand that. If we have to mark it as related item, obviously it's important. I think if it's important enough to be reported, it ought to have a place here where you know that that is a factor. And it's important to me that that is a factor. And I think some of our board members, pretty well split, feels like this is important enough for people to know there is such a thing And if the consequence is nothing more than it gets reported to the state, I don't even know that if we don't make some changes. Dr. Vasquez, and then I'll go to Member Salamanca.
On the referral, what is it? Because that's what the parent receives. What's on the referral?
So on the referral towards the bottom, you have your assessor offenses, the things that must be reported. So on the referral, I'm going to just use a level 4. I'm just going to say bullying. If the bullying was determined, it's a level 4, but it was based on hate speech is also checked off as one of those related items.
On the referral?
On the referral, yes.
And how it's reported to the state, it's also reflected that way?
Yes.
All right.
Except that I don't have anything here as a parent that tells me that hate speech is even defined. So I think it should be here if it's getting reported. Even if nothing else happens, I think there should be something that says there is such a thing and here's how it's defined. Mr. Palmerini.
So I think the simplest way to do this, just as thinking about it, I would, in that section on page 54, say a couple things. One, pursuant to the assessor requirements, we have to, if it is found to be an act of hate, we have to report it to the Florida Department of Education as required by state board rule. Add that in, number 1. Number 2, to get the board to where I think you all want to go, to the extent we make a finding that it is an act of hate, it could enhance the penalty, i.e. take a level 2 to a level 3. And we can even use the vandalism example and just have those 2 sentences.
One more sentence. I'm
Sure.
reading that. I still don't know what makes it an act of hate. I know it, you and I know it, that it has to be singling out based on your this, that, or the other. And I think if we include that, then I go, okay, wait a minute. It can't be that this kid hated that kid. It has to, like you explained that one situation where he called him, whatever, a Jew lawyer.
Right.
That's not why he did it. So I do want to make sure that when somebody reads it, they go, oh, it's not hate speech if it's one person not liking another. It has to be about a segment of our population.
So, and I think the language that says an act of hate occurs when a student intentionally selects the victim because of any protected characteristic.
Yes.
I think that language is in the revision. So I think that
Okay,
gets you
no,
where
I
you want to go.
want the 2 things you mentioned and that language, and I think we got it covered. Yeah.
Now, but the other 2 sentences, if it's found to be an act of hate, it gets reported to assessor pursuant to State Board of
Exactly.
Education
Yeah, those
rule.
other 2 sentences.
And
yes.
if there is a penalty that is, if we determine that the act was an act of hate, we will enhance the consequence from a level 2 to a level 3, or what, and use that as an example, and we'll
Yes.
get where we need to go. Okay.
I'm good with that, but that's okay. Member Salamanca.
I feel like we've been talking different languages because this is, so when we got the flag example, we got a folder that had the referral in it and it had a check mark that said hate crime. And one of the things that created all the conflict was the fact that then we undid it, and therefore the parent, right, and this is part of the process, right, which is on the ground who checks that box. And then when it goes up the chain of legal and school board, that getting unchecked is what creates conflict, right? So my existing stance is that the existing process we have accounts for the documentation of what this is. What we don't have right now is that we don't have any escalation or enhancement of punishment because of this. So overall, I was saying it's really difficult to define hate speech or hate crime. Therefore, I have a hard time telling our teachers or parents to check that box. It's just going to create the same thing over and over again of maybe the definition goes up and down. So if we are to still say we want an enhancement, we want an increase in consequences of that, then that's when I was saying it shouldn't be a standalone. It should be the way that it is currently set up as an additional enhancement, whatever, additive thing. But I agree with you. We should then just have it here in that form because parents see it in the referral. It's what they've been seeing.
Right.
And I don't know if there's any other thing on there that enhances stuff that is ESSER related that we aren't adding on here. But if there is, maybe we should pull it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of sections that have the little boxes underneath it that you check for that. I can't see.
Oh, there
Okay.
it is. Yeah, that's one. So yeah, so my whole thing is, I think our current thing addresses this. It includes it. The only thing it hasn't addressed in the historical context is the punishment being more because of this. But I think the threshold for defining hate speech and proving it should be high. And my conflict with the policy is that a teacher or administrator might check that box at the point of something happening, and that doesn't make it so. And so I don't know if there's a process question of don't check the box until, like maybe there's a recommendation of that checkbox, but then it gets done. Because the minute the parent gets the referral, they see that that was checked.
Correct.
Whether that is correct or not. And that is what ends up creating a lot of procedural
That's a very good
things.
point.
It's really hard for
Yeah.
us to undo the checking of that box.
Well, two things. One, I'd like to know if there's a procedural way, because I think that's a really good point. And two, I think in this language, that if we also have the caveat that the whole issue of freedom of speech, so that people know ahead of time, wait a minute, it's not what I think, there's actually a legal parameter on this, would be helpful as well. So we're not creating the wrong expectations coming into this. Mr.
So
Palmerini?
the whole, that sentence about it's going to be reviewed for compliance with law,
Yeah.
just being transparent here, that I didn't want to suggest potential defenses for students to an act of hate by saying, freedom of speech and that kind of stuff. That's why I did it
Yes.
this way.
Yeah, I agree.
I would suggest we keep it this way, number one. Number two, with respect to the whole process issue, remember, the referral is the initiation of the process. We have a whole DTM process where a student can come in, but we notify the parents that, hey, you're entitled to a DTM hearing, you're entitled to present fact and evidence. So we can have a DTM, and I'm sure Mickey's folks have done this, where they present evidence, hey, this is not a hate crime because A, B, C, and D, and you're like, you're right, it's not. So this is the initial charging document, but at the end of the day, there's a whole factual place where they can argue their evidence, and then there's an additional level where they can have an administrative hearing where they can argue their evidence, and that's what the whole disciplinary process is. So it's less concerning to me from a due process standpoint. I understand the whole, oh God, my kid's just been charged with a hate crime, that would set me off as a parent, but there's multiple choke points within the process that would allow that to fall off if the evidence isn't sufficient.
Right. And as the parent of the victim, I don't see that. So I'm not going, whoa, that's what it was. Whoa, they took it away. Yeah. No, I think that's good. Are anybody objecting to the direction we're going? Anybody know what it is? I think we do. I think I know what it is. I think John and I and Melmer Salamanca think we know what it is. I'm just hoping next week we all thought we knew what each other was thinking. So, okay.
So
Yes.
let me summarize.
Yeah.
So we're going to have the language that we have here on page 52. We have the acts of hate occurs when that language stays in. All charges under the category of the act of hate must be reviewed for OCPS by the OCPS Office of Legal Services for compliance with law. That stays in. We will add
Question for you. Right now, are we under notification to parents?
Yes.
As opposed to under the Code of Student Conduct?
Yes, that's why I was summarizing where I think we are, and
Okay.
then tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
We will add a sentence that says, pursuant to Cessor, we have to, if it is determined that the student committed an act of hate, and I will certainly draft this much better than I'm saying it right now, that has to be noticed to the Florida Department of Education and through Cessor, pursuant to State Board of Education rules. If it is found that the student committed an act of hate when committing a penalty or whatever, a charge, an offense, that the level will be enhanced from, and we'll give the example, level 2 vandalism to level 3 vandalism. We'll add that sentence in, and as I understand it, the separate offenses under level 3 and level 4 that we have currently in there would come out. That's my understanding of where we are.
Say that last part again. Oh.
The level 3, and where it's acts of hate is listed in level 3 and level 4, that would come out.
Madam Chair, may I? Okay, so we have two versions that we've prepared. We've only looked at one, but the second version just eliminates the separate categorization. I can't even speak. What is being proposed is that we take that part out, and under the section acts of hate, we enhance the language in there to describe what's going to happen if you commit another offense and it is deemed to be hate related. It will bump it up. I mean, that's not the legal terminology. So it would be spelled out explicitly in that section, but it would not be up in this, like in the different levels.
Okay, but when I'm looking at the actual violations and the consequences are greater because if it gets defined as an act of speech, which we're saying elsewhere, when we are dealing with after the offenses, what is it called, where it's the consequences. The consequences will include that the consequences
are going to be elevated if it's deemed to be an act of hate. So it will be stipulated. We already have it in the referral, but in the code of conduct, that will also be stipulated.
Okay, so, but we have, I don't remember if it's here or if it's in that, kind of like a spreadsheet, says if you do this and it's level 3, this happens. Will it be there that it's clear to me that that's where the enhancement occurs? So if it's destruction of property and it's a level 3, unless it's also an act of hate, then it becomes a level 4, which is what we're talking about, it's enhancement. But in that spreadsheet thing, that table, it's not going to say.
No, but
Well, if you're saying it's a level 3, but it might be a level 4, but you don't say why it's a level 4. For everything else, we might say it's a one-time thing, it's a repeated thing, it's happened before, now it's a.
But when you put the language on the notification of parents, because that's in the code of conduct, it has put everybody who reads it on notice that if they are found to have committed an act of hate as part of an underlying offense, their penalty will be bumped up. You don't need to necessarily have it in every section. Just by including that language within the narrative on page 54, it gets you where you need to go. It serves as notification. From a legal standpoint, there's ways that if you put it if you had a separate offense in each level, you could do that. Honestly, I think that's going to be more confusing to folks because they're going to see that it's a separate offense. And from what I've heard from the members of the board up here, I'm not necessarily sure that there's consensus to have it be a separate offense.
Yeah, I'm actually not talking about that. I wish I
sorry,
had the
my bad.
table in front of me. I'm talking about there's a level 3 when it happens once, it's a level, 2 when it happens once, level 3 if it happens repeatedly.
ladder?
Huh?
The discipline ladder?
Yeah, the discipline ladder, yeah. And I just don't understand how you can say something's a level 3 or it's a level 4 and not say why it became a level 4. No, why wouldn't that be in the matrix? Why? Is that the matrix? Okay.
So you're doing anything in the matrix. Pick anything, but if it's done in the context of a hate crime.
Okay, let's not do trespassing just because that's like not the best one. Let's try destruction's the easiest one, I think.
Right.
Go ahead, Dr. Beth.
So on the referral, we would have vandalism or destruction of property. And then there would be the little check mark on the bottom of the referral, right? Or isn't that where we have the indication? I don't have the referral in front of me. That says hate crime. So on the referral, it would have that. And then when we report it to Cessor, it would also reflect that. Correct? Does that make sense? No.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
It seems like everything else, when it goes from a 3 to a 4, there's an explanation of why it went from a 3 to a 4.
It would be on the referral,
Yes.
and then
I
it would
know, but I
also,
don't
when
get
we
the
report it, it
referral.
would also be there.
Till I've broken the rule, and I wanted, this is so you know, before you break the rule, what the consequences are.
But we're explaining that in the section, in the narrative,
Under
which
the-
we can make that, I mean, we could move where that is placed. We can highlight it, bold it, make it bigger font, but that's where we would be explaining that. No, go down, go down. Okay.
Willful malicious destruction of board property. Breaking or damaging things that belong to the school or someone else. Okay, that's a level 3 offense. How does it get, what's the difference between the level 3 and the level 4?
For destruction of property, it's the dollar amount.
Okay. Okay, so we tell why it's a 4. And, or it could be a 4, same dollar amount, but it
Hate
is.
related.
Yeah.
It's hate related, yes.
Right. I'm just saying, if we're going to tell the dollar amount for 3 and 4, we ought to explain that it could have been a 4 because of. Maybe that's complicated, but
So
And I'll give up.
I think
I'll just give up.
what
All
I'm
right,
understanding is that you just want parents to see that a level 3 can be enhanced to a level 4 if it's based on, if we determine that it's an act of hate, correct?
Yeah, I
Okay.
want to see it where
Okay,
it's there,
so
not.
would it work if we put it in one of these paragraphs here? So this
Yes.
is a level 3?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so we can do
Okay.
that.
Okay, yes, yes.
Yes, we can do that.
Perfect, yes.
So
Thank
it
you.
won't, it wouldn't be under a specific offense, but we would say that a level 3 can be enhanced to a level 4 if it's determined, yes.
Perfect,
we
much
can put that in.
easier. Very good, thank you. Okay, thank you, Member Byrd. Sorry, I didn't, could have shut up 15 minutes, right? Okay, anybody have a problem with the direction we're going? Yay, okay, good. Okay, we have 7 minutes for a real development workshop. Dr. Vasquez? I think we're ready to move on. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh,
We have the board meeting, but I thought this is,
Oh, good. Oh,
am I wrong?
okay, good.
Do you have something else? No.
I'm sorry.
The restitution, we didn't come to a
I can't hear you. I can't hear you. And I
The
can't hear this.
restitution, we didn't come to a
Oh, yeah,
consensus on.
Please, okay, so,
Yes.
yeah, we need that. Thank you. She's like, we were there, so close. All right, so let's go back to restitution.
All right, 6 minutes. Counting down. Okay.
It's my understanding that we want to leave it. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just, just like I said before, we just need to add and specify that we have alternatives to that. So I don't know if you already took notes of what I said before? Okay, that's perfect. That's all. Thank you so much.
Examples. Okay.
Okay.
Example, that's the one that was either, we could do community service or tutoring or restorative.
Yeah.
Alternative. Well, thank you. Just write it down.
Okay. All right, anything else? Yay. We got 5 minutes. Anybody want to talk? No. Okay, so this meeting is now adjourned. We'll see everybody back here at 4 o'clock. Right? Okay.